permission, I believe. College, so we're going to be ready in 1 minute for our next candidate, right? Are they outside? Let them know. Oh, they want around. Great. So folks, hang on in your seats. We're not going to have a break. I will ask. And great. Once again, thank you, Mr. Borough President Scott. We are rolling right along here, folks. Please join us. Show me. Oh, you already have it. Right, there you go. We can get rid of that. Exactly. There you go. Hold on one sec, a moment of housekeeping. All right, ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce our next speaker, I'm just going to repeat the ground rules and the structure of tonight, which you already know, but so that the former governor hears it as well. You are at the Democracy for New York City Living Liberally Act Now Comptroller Forum at the Tank. The groups that have come together tonight are independent progressive groups that are putting on this forum. The questions I'll be asking have been submitted in advance, either online, if people are doing, or on index cards. And I will be pulling from those questions and shaping them to get at the heart of some of the themes that we saw in questions again and again. You all will hear some of the same questions again, but that's because we want the two candidates vying for our votes and our support to answer some of the same issues. I'm Justin Krabs. I'm one of the founders of Living Liberally, as well as at the Tank, which is a nonprofit space for performing arts and ideas. We're going to speak for about 35 minutes. Try to keep it very, very fair. What's that? Oh, I'm good. I'm good. And this is your ball, right?
I think so.
Just want to make sure it was sealed. So 35 minutes to keep it totally fair. Governor Spitzer can begin with a 3-minute opening. We'll have a 2-minute closing. And in general, we're going to ask you to keep questions relatively short, or answers relatively short, so we can get through a lot of different questions. And with that, I present to you the former Governor of New York and Attorney General of New York, Eliot Spitzer.
Well, thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here. I like the way you frame this, Living Liberally, Act Now. I think that is what I have tried to do in my government career as Attorney General, as Governor. I think I was ahead of the curve on the issues that matter and matter to those of us in this room. And I would look at the issues that have been in the newspapers recently, from stop and frisk, where in 1999 my office did the first, and still what is the seminal investigation of stop and frisk, to frame the issue, take it from something that was experiential, and crystallize it into a debate that then became and culminated in yesterday's litigation in what is an important constitutional decision that will be upheld on appeal and will reshape the way we think about policing. The issues of Wall Street, where the economic cataclysm and all the talk we hear about protecting the middle class took the biggest hit in the history of this nation because of the economic crisis of 2008. Those who are sitting on the sidelines passively watching the pieces fall into place that led to that crisis cannot, in my mind, fairly say that they were there protecting the middle class. It was clear what was happening. As Attorney General, we began making subprime cases in 1999, way ahead of the curve. And these were not isolated data points. We said that these are structural problems that will metastasize into a larger problem. It was subprime lending, it was the analysts, the insurance industry, the mutual fund industry. Over and over, we brought the structural cases that we said, and I pointed out to the CEOs, I said, these are going to be more devastating to our economy than you can possibly imagine. In the context of the environment, we did the NSR cases, the New Source Review cases, enforced the Clean Air Act to prevent acid rain from coming down to New York. We stopped buses from idling in front of schools. We did the things that were creative, that were different. Fully funded education when I was governor, to the tune of $1.76 billion of budget that was heralded as being monumental, fundamental change in the way education finance was structured here in the city. Healthcare finance, we protected women's rights over and over in terms of both access to clinics when I was Attorney General, establishing as constitutional law the notion of the bubble that would surround clinics to ensure that you could get access. Over and over again, we were there establishing the principles of the liberal community we believe in, ahead of the curve, not waiting for others to wage the battle and then jumping in late. In fact, the one that I would point to where we did not succeed, but which I'm nonetheless and perhaps most proud of, trying to get driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. You may remember, the heavens opened and descended upon us. We stood up, I stood up, and I said, this is right. It is good economics. It is right at a moral level. These are things we should be doing. It was horrific what happened when Lou Dobbs led the right and there was a pushback that unfortunately we did not have the allies we needed. It is now the law of the land. In many states, the president has supported it. Same-sex marriage. In 1998, when I ran for Attorney General, I was for same-sex marriage. I did not mean to evolve on this issue. I believe in evolution. It's a matter of science. But I don't believe in evolution on some of these moral issues where, as a matter of first principles, we should know what we stand for. In 2006, when I ran for governor, I was still the only statewide Democrat in the state of New York supportive of same-sex marriage. So I go way back on these issues. These are not issues where I take positions as a matter of pragmatism, as a matter of whole-driven politics, positions I take, whether it's Wall Street, civil rights, the environment, immigrant rights, low-wage labor. These are things we do as a matter of principle. And that's my opening.
Great. And I think many of us here are familiar with your record as Attorney General and as Governor and as being a leader on many of these issues. So I think the question that we got again and again, in addition to the question that we got, which was what does the Office of Comptroller do?
Right.
But to make it a little more specific, what can you do with that office, with the powers, the levers, the mechanisms, differently than the current and previous office holders that will make you effective in that role?
You know, the same question I was asked before I ran for Attorney General. And I said, that if you look at the jurisdiction of an office and understand what the levers and what the capacity is, you can, in fact, reimagine it. You can use it very differently. There are three buckets that I look at in the Comptroller's office, each one of which can be used in a very different way. One, $140 billion. It's our money, not theirs. And as I say, you know, I'm not there to count the money, I'm there to make the money count. Ownership trumps regulation. All the stuff I did on Wall Street through prosecution and regulations that we imposed as a consequence of either settlements or laws that were passed because of the problems that we highlighted, pale in comparison to what we can do as owners of the companies where we as stakeholders, the shares that we own, $140 billion of equity ownership, gives us the capacity to act in a way without needing to find a hook of a legal violation. Our fiduciary obligation is to act in the long-term interest of ourselves as shareholders, those who are owed the pensions, and to act in a way to reform corporate structure. What does that mean? It means when the corporate boards are paying CEOs too much, we step in. It means when they are putting people on risk management committees who don't understand risk management, we say stop. It means that we separate the CEO and the board chair because as a matter of checks and balances, corporate governance, it's the right thing to do. It also means we get involved in issues such as divestiture, which when I was in college was the issue, the moral issue of the moment. But it's not just the moral issues, it is the corporate governance issues, because the economic cataclysm of '08 resulted from a failure of corporate judgment. And that we could have stopped. All right, so that's one. You also manage the pension funds in a way to get returns. It's not being done right now. It's performing subpar, paying $400 million a year in fees. And there is indeed, it's been studied in Maryland Public Policy Institute just came out with a study, an inverse correlation between the fees paid and the returns you get, which makes sense. It's counterintuitive, but it makes sense because you pay a lot of fees to people who then act in a risk-averse way. And what do? They say, put the money with the Goldmans and the JP Morgan Chases, the Citibanks, because that way they can't be criticized. If you actually bring in-house the management, you will manage it better. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is the audits that are done. Audits, it sounds terribly boring. You know, you put on your green eye shades and you count the number of paper clips delivered, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is, are the policies we're paying for producing the results we expect? For all we're paying for education, what we've seen over in the past week is that the education performance numbers are way down. We all knew there was going to be some sort of drop because there was a new testing system that was imposed, rightly so. The magnitude of that drop should have been shocking to all of us. We are investing a ton of money in our school system. We're not getting the results. Healthcare, infrastructure, school, transportation, all of these various major elements, you audit them to see where is the money going and what are we getting back. And you become, in a way, the think tank for the city. This is not a political office as such. It should not be. You get along with the mayor. You work in an advisory role saying, hey, you know what? We have the capacity to study, to investigate, to pursue. Here's what is not working and here's what is working. Third bucket, and I don't want to eat up all the 35 minutes, is in fact oversight of the city budget. We actually have to make sure revenues and expenditures line up, that the revenues in the out years, we have some budget crises. We're not Detroit, we're not Chicago. Everybody after the Detroit bankruptcy said, oh my goodness, or are we about to become that? The answer is no. But is there some sensibility that we've got to be careful, cautious, of course? So you oversee the revenue to make sure that they are in alignment with what we are spending, something that obviously I had to do when I was governor, and we did it properly and spent time discussing that.
Let's dig into a couple of those buckets. You talked about that right now, the managers are paid so much that they're risk averse. That's a problem. So the solution would be people willing to take more risks, which also can sound counterintuitive. So tell me, what you
Well, I mean, not necessarily more risk
see
in
the
the
problem,
portfolio.
what's the solution?
It's not just in creating more risk the risk I described is the risk in the allocation to the managers, not the risk in the portfolio itself. It's like a board of directors choosing a law firm, something we probably more of us in this room have experience with. You go to the big name
Biggest one.
on the principle that nobody can criticize us if we pick Cravath or Paul Weiss or Skadden Arps, right? It may in fact be the case that there's a smaller boutique firm out there that has the expertise that will litigate it better and cheaper and get you the result you need. But again, the risk-averse nature of the decision maker is to shy away from
So
it.
it's not that Goldman or JP Morgan needs to make different decisions, but that we might choose other managers.
Precisely, and in fact, we should bring in-house some of the management decisions, which in fact is what is done in most of the pensions across the nation for good reason. You hire the people think about $400 million spent on fees. You can hire not only a professional staff, a superb professional staff. Now again, this is their metrics. This is an effort to get returns because we have a fiduciary obligation to those who will be paid the pensions. So this is what you do. You have to find the right people, not simply pay fees so that people can cover themselves to be risk averse.
You also brought up divestiture, and many of the questions we got had to do with the way that U.S. Comptroller would handle the various social issues, labor issues, environmental issues. One of the questions I thought was interesting is where is the role for shareholder activism? Where's the role for divestiture? What's the line past which you decide, no, our money's not better there, working there, it's better to pull out?
Well, there is no simple answer to that. I think divestiture is the easy one. There is an unambiguous moral obligation not to invest in a regime based upon racist principle. That's easy. The harder one is, do you divest from a company that doesn't have the precise wage policy that you like, or do you work as a shareholder to try to get the company to do what you'd like it to do?
Fossil fuels comes up again and again in the question.
Look, the fossil fuels, I think, right, because in fact when I was Attorney General, we began to make the case that companies should disclose. Now, the entry point was we want companies to disclose back then that there was a risk that was attendant to the use of the fossil fuels that would expose them theoretically to litigation, but also that we as a shareholder would then have that risk because they could be subject to litigation risk itself. There, I don't think we yet divest from any energy company that has a fossil fuel component, although we might want to say to companies, and this I think we certainly would want to do, you cannot use your corporate funds to lobby against the principles of global warming and smart economic policy, environmental policy that we support. In fact, my view is that we would want to go to corporations and say, and the answer to Citizens United, by the way, is not going to be that we overturn the Supreme Court decisions. That's not going to happen. They're just given the configuration of the court. The answer is that we go to corporations and say, don't waste your money, because it's our money, arguing for political positions that do not reflect our views as your shareholders. In other words, you say to them, stick to your knitting, as it were. Build a better widget. Reform your corporate governance so that you can perform better. Leave the politics to the political arena. Don't spend your money lobbying on Capitol Hill in opposition to smart environmental policies. And so that is one of the ways that you do it. But I'll give you, shareholder power has got to be used to influence corporate policy so that, as I said, you put people on boards who have the skill sets you need, people on risk management committees so you have the skills you need. That would have saved us the economic cataclysm of 2008.
In staying with divestiture for one more moment, Borough President brought up that he voted on one of the boards that he serves on to divest from gun manufacturers. Would you agree that that is a place where we should divest, or if you were in that?
You can go back to the Slate articles I've written, and one in particular right after the massacre in Connecticut. In fact, I called Tom DiNapoli that morning and I said, Tom, New York State, I would bet, is invested with Cerberus. Cerberus is the private equity firm that owned Bushmasters that produced the AR-15. Turns out, in fact, the city and the state were. I said, call Cerberus and tell them to sell the company or to divest themselves of that investment. Yeah, so yes, absolutely. We don't want to be making money on the manufacture of AR-15s. There are lots of ways to make more money. And so when somebody says, well, are you violating your fiduciary obligation by not investing in the most profitable enterprises out there, my answer is yes, within the moral bounds that we believe to be appropriate.
Another set of questions that came up from organizations like this, which are independent grassroots organizations that often get turned to when a candidate is campaigning. A candidate comes and says, I want your vote, your endorsement, your boots on the ground. A complaint that I've heard is that they don't get called upon when an elected official is governing. That the use a candidate has for the grassroots dries up as soon as they're in office of power. How would you want to see grassroots groups engage with the Office of Comptroller, and how have you engaged grassroots groups in your work as Attorney General and Governor?
Well, we did when I was Attorney General and Governor. We actually, because the change, I believe, whether it was the environmental change or working for same-sex marriage or even Wall Street, was based upon the notion that all change in our society has come through grassroots activism. If you look at our history, past century, the women's movement, the peace movement, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movements, every one of those has had its genesis in a grassroots format. Politicians only come in after the fact, much later, and rarely, in fact, lead the movement. It is vice versa. Occupy Wall Street, which I had a very close relationship with, I hoped would become more. It did not ultimately have that structure, but we need that grassroots activism. Sometimes it's a little discomforting. Remember early on when I was Attorney General, we went to court to preserve community gardens here in the city. And the caption on the case was the people of the state of New York by Attorney General and the green gorillas versus the city of New York. I was a little worried that we were litigating with the green gorillas, but we got grassroots activists to join us in these cases. Whether it was, as I said, the environmental cases, or and we went to court. We lost this one, unfortunately, all the way to the Supreme Court on a theory that global warming permitted us to sue on a nuisance theory against the energy companies to come back to fossil fuels that were creating this harm. And the Supreme Court didn't buy it, but it was the beautiful thing about, for those of you who are lawyers, the beautiful thing about nuisance theory is that it's very elastic. Elasticity means it's really there in the eye of the beholder. Unfortunately, the eyes of the beholders weren't with us on that one, but it was, so.
I've been trying to find the headline, Eliot, the green gorillas, but
Right.
moving on. I think when you
we won that case. I mean, tell you a little story about that one. This was when Mayor Giuliani wanted to sell off all the community gardens to developers, and our view was it violated a number of city and state statutes. We went to court, and to his enormous ire, we got an injunction, and the injunction lasted through the end of his mayoralty. And then when Mayor Bloomberg came in, we were able to settle the case and preserve most of the gardens, which was a good thing.
I think the examples you gave resonate with this crowd in the cases where you helped provide a check on another powerful figure, a check on a Mayor Giuliani, a check on Wall Street. But of course, we keep hearing about how the Office of Comptroller needs to work very closely with the mayor. How do you see your relationship with the mayor, and how do you see your relationship with the people currently vying to be mayor? How do you both do what you do well that has excited us, which is be a check on them, and yet also be a partner?
You can be both. I was Attorney General for all 8 years with George Pataki as governor. We never once publicly disagreed. Even I was his lawyer, and my obligation as his lawyer was to represent him. And so we would. And I said, I always told him he got better representation for me than he did for my predecessor, even though my predecessor was his party. I said, I'm not good at that. But you have to work with folks in government. And I know they're, my opponent, and I like Scott, but he's out there saying, oh, well, it doesn't work well with people. That's not true. When I was in Albany, we passed a spectacular budget for the city of New York. As I mentioned, we increased education finance by $1.76 billion, changed healthcare, did so many different things. We work with people. Now, there are times when you stand up to people as well, as I did with Wall Street, when there was nobody there willing to join us. But you work with people. The job of the controller is to work with the mayor, work with the city council, be an informed voice on budgetary issues, be thoughtful in answering these issues, and be part of the team. That's what the public expects, and that's what, in fact, I did when I was Attorney General, and that's what I would do as controller.
As somebody who has served, obviously, in executive office before, what would you want to see this room of grassroots activists ask of all of the mayoral candidates? What question would you like to see us push them on to decide who we want to support?
Well, I would say that the most fundamental issues facing the city right now, obviously from the controller's perspective, it's the pensions, fiscal, budgetary issues. But put that aside. I think if you were coming in as mayor, you would say, okay, let the controller deal with that. Let some wonky person figure out what we need to put in that line item of the budget. I think the critical issue is how do you resuscitate an educational system that is failed? How do you invest in infrastructure in the city, by which I mean transportation and housing and the parks, without which we will not continue to draw the people, the human capital, the sense of antiseptic you call that way. But really, what is the difference between New York and Detroit? The difference in New York and Detroit is that Detroit had one industry. When that one industry migrated elsewhere in the nation and the world, population left the city. They were left without a tax base, without any economic or intellectual creativity. New York City survives because we are an immigrant city, where every college kid in the nation wants to come here to get a job. Every person in the world wants to come here to work, right? I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement, but that's really, right? But we're a magnet, right? And if you read Richard Florida's book, The Creative Class, people want to come here and live here and create things that are exciting. We can only do that if we have the schools so people can feel their kids will get a good education. And we have housing so people can live here. Right now, we're failing in both of those and our transportation system. You want to see the growth of the city over the past 150 years, look at the subways as they radiated out. And look at the communities that evolved. Look what's going on in Brooklyn, Long Island City right now. Look what the Second Avenue subway could do to the Bronx if we extended up into the Bronx as we should. Those are the things that really transform the city. So the mayor needs to think about how you invest in those particular areas. Now, in education, look, as I said, this week was a bad week on the education front. We got to figure this one out.
You know, one of the questions somebody asked was, and I actually don't know the role the controller plays in it, but would you push to restore the commuter tax? I think of what you were saying about people wanting to be here, but not everyone wants to live here. They just want to be here during the day. Is the commuter tax a role? Is that even something that the office of controller weighs in on?
Well, folks in Westchester really do want to be here. They just I can say that. I could have said that in 2006. Here's the thing. The city control really doesn't play a role except to go to Albany. It's a state issue. The reality is that a commuter tax was defeated and probably would continue to be defeated by the suburban votes. Upstate voters are ambivalent, but probably would form some sort of alliance with the suburban vote. That was how it shook out. And that's why we have been not as successful as we should have been in getting suburban support for the mass transportation system, which is integral to folks from the suburban ring getting into the city for the jobs.
You know, you bring up Richard Florida's book, and I know in last night's debate you referenced the notion of moving from fire to ICE,
right?
Finance, insurance,
and I gave John Sexton credit for it.
To ICE stands for
intellectual
culture and
intellectual culture and education.
Right. And here we are sitting in a non-profit performance space that is part, in a small way, of that engine that you're talking about, that has artists come through and events that are aimed at, not at a commercial aim, but at a sort of collaborative and creative aim. But the Office of Controller is one that counts the money and makes the money count.
Right.
What role do you play in relationship to these? It's what relationship can your office play? What role can your office play in relationship to the massive number of arts, creative, cultural, nonprofit institutions that aren't necessarily talking about counting the money and making the money count, but are actually working in a gift economy, sharing economy, different metrics? How does your office connect to those institutions? If those are part of what makes New York great.
Good question. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, obviously, they're discretionary funds that the controller's office has, but frankly,
that wasn't a pitch, but
no. But I mean, look, I think really what this depends upon. Look, the not-for-profit sector, and I actually learned a lot about the not-for-profit sector when I was Attorney General, because you have oversight over it. I mean, it's sort of one of those. You don't appreciate the magnitude of the sector until, as AG, you begin to look at it and see the numbers and understand all its manifestations and its role here in the city. I'm not sure there is as direct a nexus between the controller's office and the not-for-profit sector, because the types of investments that I think properly have been talking about that the controller could drive relate more to the infrastructure needs of education and even more housing and transportation, less the sort of philanthropic giving towards the not-for-profit sector, which is hugely important, but I think that has to come out of a different portion of the budget that would be pretty much within the domain of the mayor and the city council.
And where does the Office of Controller have impact over helping drive up wages or produce a living wage around the city?
Well, I think
where does that come into negotiating that?
I think there it is really a question of shareholder power. Now, this is leveraging ownership to change the behavior of the entities who we own. And I think this has been the sort of tapped capacity that we as citizens have overlooked, because it's hard. It's easy for us to say prosecute them, regulate them. But in a way, I feel that those have become intellectual crutches, and we have forgotten that the pension funds are ours. The mutual funds are ours. The huge reservoirs of capital out there it's our money, and we have ceded authority over it to the Goldmans, the Morgan Chases, who determine how the proxies will be voted, and hence have taken from us our capacity as owners to change behavior. So we could. Different example perhaps, but what occurred to me the other day in the context of the fires in Bangladesh, where we have seen horrific failures of humanity. The companies that produce there are owned again by us and through our pension funds. We should have collaboration among different pension funds saying to the Walmarts, to the JCPenney's, whoever produces there, if you produce overseas, you must ensure this threshold of safety and wages. Now we can do the same thing domestically. And we can begin to do the same thing through shareholder power, changing corporate behavior.
You know, one of the delightful things about how quickly you speak is that you're going to get asked more questions than your rival did. But I will ask you.
I will slow down.
No problem. In fact, that's part of what. I was glad you mentioned Lou Dobbs in your opening, and I was also glad that he left the air before you did as an anchor.
Here's one of the ironies. He left the 8 o'clock show at CNN, which I then inherited. But he then went over to Fox, which I don't let.
You're not there. So I will ask you one of the questions that we asked your rival as well. Did you vote for Scott Stringer for borough president?
Oh my. There were 8 of them, weren't there?
The first time.
Not 8 borough presidents. There were 8 candidates. That was the antecedent was a little ambiguous. I don't remember.
Lions and tigers and bears, oh my.
So and if you don't